The law offices of Davies, Finch, and Gable smelled of old money and older secrets. The air, thick with the scent of leather-bound books and lemon floor polish, was a heavy blanket in the conference room. Sunlight, filtered through the tall, mullioned windows overlooking a manicured Boston Square, did little to warm the oppressive silence. 3 figures sat around a vast mahogany table, its surface polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting their strained faces like distorted masks. At the head of the table sat Eleanor Sterling, the newly widowed matriarch. At 65, she was a woman carved from ice and ambition, her silver blonde hair coiffed into a perfect helmet, her black Chanel suit a fortress against grief. She tapped a perfectly manicured nail on the table, the rhythmic click-click-click, the only sound in the room. Across from her, her son Mark fiddled with the knot of his silk tie. He was the spitting image of his late father Richard, the same square jaw, the same shrewd eyes. But where Richard had possessed a quiet gravitas, Mark radiated a restless, predatory energy. He was a man who measured life in acquisitions, and today he expected to acquire the lion's share of the Sterling Empire. And then there was Clara. At 28, she seemed almost an afterthought in the family portrait. Where Eleanor was ice, Clara was water, gentle, unassuming, and often underestimated. She sat slightly apart, her hands clasped in the lap of her simple black dress. She was the only one whose eyes were red-rimmed, her sorrow genuine and profound. She hadn't loved her father for his fortune, but for the rare, quiet moments they'd shared in his study, surrounded by books, and the comfortable silence of mutual understanding. He had been her anchor in a family that often felt like a turbulent sea. "Can we begin, Mr. Davies?" Eleanor's voice was crisp, cutting through the stillness. "Some of us have arrangements to make." Mr. Davies, a man whose gray suit seemed to have absorbed the solemnity of 1,000 such meetings, cleared his throat. He adjusted his spectacles and opened the heavy vellum folder before him. "Of course, Eleanor. My deepest condolences to you all once again. Richard was a singular man." Mark leaned forward, his interest piqued. "He was a titan. His legacy is secure. Now, if you would." Clara flinched at the cold transactionality of her brother's words. For him, their father's life was being reduced to a balance sheet. She looked at her mother, expecting a flicker of censure, a hint of shared grief. She found none. Eleanor's gaze was fixed on the will, her expression one of intense, unreadable concentration. A knot of anxiety tightened in Clara's stomach. It was a familiar feeling, a low-grade hum of dread that had been the background music of her entire life. A sense that the pristine facade of the Sterling family was built upon foundations of sand. Today, for some reason, the humming was louder than ever, a premonition that the tide was about to come in. Mr. Davies began to read. His voice, a dry and steady monotone, filled the room as he detailed Richard Sterling's final wishes. The vast portfolio of stocks and bonds, the real estate holdings spanning from Beacon Hill to the Hamptons, the art collection that was the envy of museums. It was a litany of immense wealth, a testament to a life of relentless success. A significant portion was bequeathed to various philanthropic causes, a children's hospital, a university research grant, gestures that were quintessentially Richard. Mark's posture relaxed with each clause. He was named CEO of Sterling Industries, a position he'd long coveted. A trust fund of staggering proportions was established in his name. He shot a triumphant, almost pitying look at Clara. Eleanor was named the primary beneficiary of the liquid assets and the sprawling family estate, a predictable and traditional arrangement. She maintained her composure, but a small, satisfied smile touched the corners of her lips. Finally, Mr. Davies paused on a smaller trust set aside for Clara. It was generous by any normal standard, but a pittance compared to what Mark and Eleanor would receive. It was enough to ensure she would never have to work, but not enough to give her any real power within the family. Clara felt a familiar sting of dismissal, but no surprise. It was the role she had always played. "And that," Mr. Davies said, looking up, "concludes the primary division of assets." He took a sip of water, his hand trembling slightly. "However, there is a final addendum, a codicil Richard added himself just 6 months ago." A new tension electrified the air. Mark frowned. An addendum? What sort of addendum? Mr. Davies's eyes, full of a weary sorrow, found Clara's for a fleeting moment before he looked back down at the page. He cleared his throat and his voice took on a graver tone. It reads as follows: "The bulk of my personal fortune, the contents of the primary sterling trust, currently valued at approximately $400 million, is to be held in escrow." Mark bolted upright. What? Held in escrow? On what grounds? Let me finish, Mark, the lawyer said, his voice firm. He continued reading from Richard's own words. This fortune is not to be distributed as previously outlined, but will instead be awarded in its entirety to the one person in this room who can tell the truth. It will go to whoever confesses here and now what really happened to my first wife, Isabel Sterling, on the night she died. The world tilted. Isabel, Clara's biological mother, the woman who had died in a tragic fall down the grand staircase of their home when Clara was just a toddler. It had been ruled an accident, a horrible, tragic accident. A choked gasp escaped Mark's lips. This is insane. He wasn't well at the end. He was paranoid. But Clara was watching her mother. The icy composure had shattered. Eleanor's face was a deathly white, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to hollow her out from the inside. The polished veneer was gone, and in its place was raw, naked panic. The room was silent, save for the frantic thumping of Clara's own heart. The lawyer's words echoed, a posthumous accusation from the grave. What really happened to my wife? Then came the sound that would forever haunt Clara's nightmares. The sharp, violent scrape of a chair leg against the polished floor. Eleanor had pushed herself back from the table, her hands flying to her mouth, her body trembled, a storm of sobs building in her chest. Through her fingers, a single horrifying whisper slithered into the silence, a confession torn from the depths of a 30-year-old secret. It was me. Clara felt the blood drain from her face, the room swimming in a gray haze as her father's will transformed from a legal document into a verdict. The drive back to the family estate was a masterclass in suffocating silence. Mark drove the black sedan with a white-knuckled grip on the wheel, his jaw set like granite. In the passenger seat, Eleanor stared out the window, her face a blank mask, the earlier storm of emotion now contained behind a terrifyingly placid dam. Clara sat in the back, feeling as small and as breakable as a child. The familiar streets of their affluent suburb, with their stately homes and pristine lawns, seemed alien and menacing, each window a watching eye. The moment they stepped into the cavernous marble foyer of the Sterling mansion, the dam broke. What in God's name were you thinking? Mark's voice, a low and furious growl, echoed off the cold stone. He rounded on Eleanor, his face contorted with disbelief and rage. Confessing? There? Are you out of your mind? Eleanor finally crumbled. I didn't know what to do, she wailed, her hands fluttering helplessly. He knew. Richard knew. All these years I thought, but he knew. Her sobs were raw, jagged things, but Clara watched her with a strange, chilling detachment. Was this the sound of remorse, or the sound of being caught? He didn't know anything, Mark spat, pacing the foyer like a caged tiger. He suspected. He was an old man, grieving and paranoid. It was a bluff, Mother, a sick, twisted game to test us, and you walked right into it. You threw away $400 million for a ghost story. It's not a ghost story, Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. The words felt foreign on her tongue. Both heads snapped towards her. Mark's eyes narrowed. Stay out of this, Clara. You don't understand the stakes. I understand that Father believed my mother was murdered, Clara said, a new, fragile strength taking root in her shock. And I understand that our mother just confessed to it. She looked directly at Eleanor, whose tear-streaked face was now a mixture of fear and something else. Resentment. You don't know what you're talking about, Eleanor whimpered, pulling a silk handkerchief from her sleeve. Your father and I, it was complicated. Isabel, she was unstable. It was an accident. I was there. I tried to help her, but she fell. I panicked. I said what Richard wanted to hear, that's all. The lie was so blatant, so poorly constructed, it was an insult. Clara felt a cold fury rise within her. eclipsing the shock. An accident. For 30 years, her life had been defined by that word. The accidental death of her mother, the woman she only knew from a single, faded photograph on her father's desk, a woman with kind eyes and a smile that Clara had always wished she'd known. "So you lied," Clara stated, her voice gaining clarity and volume. "You lied then, or you're lying now? Which is it?" "Enough!" Mark shouted, stepping between them, his body a physical barrier. He pointed a finger at Clara. "This family is in a crisis, and you are not helping. We are going to fix this. Mr. Davies will be contacted. We'll contest the codicil on the grounds of diminished capacity. We will say Mother was overwrought with grief and misspoke. We will protect this family." His eyes, so like their father's, were hard and unyielding. But where Richard's held wisdom, Mark's held only a lust for power and a desperate need to control the narrative. He was looking at his mother not as a potential murderer, but as a liability to his inheritance. Clara stared at her brother, and for the first time, she saw him for what he truly was, a stranger. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was filled with the ugly, writhing shapes of their family's truths. The mansion, once a symbol of security, now felt like a tomb, and Clara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was trapped inside with them. For 2 days, the Sterling mansion was a Cold War theater. Eleanor remained secluded in her wing, a tragic figure performing grief for an audience of one. Mark was a whirlwind of frantic phone calls, his voice a low, urgent murmur as he plotted with lawyers to invalidate his father's final wish. He treated Clara with a dismissive contempt, as if she were a piece of furniture that had inconveniently developed an opinion. But Clara was no longer furniture. The confession had been a key, unlocking a part of her she hadn't known existed. The quiet, accommodating daughter was gone, replaced by a seeker of truth. She found herself drawn, as if by a magnetic pull, to her father's private study. It had been his sanctuary, the one room in the house that felt authentically his, filled with the scent of old paper, pipe tobacco, and his spicy cologne. Since his death, Mark had locked it, declaring it off-limits until the estate is settled. Clara, however, remembered the spare key. Her father had shown it to her years ago, hidden behind a loose brick in the library fireplace. "For emergencies, my dear," he'd said with a sad smile. "Or for when you just need a quiet place to think." This, she thought, qualified as an emergency. With trembling hands, she retrieved the old brass key and let herself into the study. The air was still and cool. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light, piercing the heavy velvet curtains. Everything was exactly as he had left it. A half-empty glass of scotch on the side table, a book of poetry open on his leather armchair. It felt like he had just stepped out for a moment. Clara's purpose was singular. She ignored the shelves of first editions and the priceless art. She went directly to his massive mahogany desk. Her father had been a meticulous man. If he had harbored a suspicion so deep, he would wager his entire fortune on it. There would be evidence. She began to search, her fingers tracing the smooth wood, pulling open drawers filled with old business files and correspondence. In the bottom right-hand drawer, beneath a stack of old tax returns, she found it. It wasn't a file, but a small, black, leather-bound journal. It was unmarked. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she opened it. The first page was dated just a month after Isabel's death. The handwriting was her father's, tight, precise, and filled with a palpable anguish. "They tell me it was an accident," it began. "The police, the doctors, even Eleanor, they all say Isabel slipped, that her heel caught on the rug at the top of the stairs. But I was there. I saw the rug. It was perfectly flat. I saw the look in Eleanor's eyes when she told the story. Not grief, not shock, triumph." Clara sank into her father's chair, the leather sighing around her. She read on, devouring decades of private torment and methodical observation. Her father had documented every inconsistency, every lie. He noted how Eleanor, his then secretary whom he'd married a year after Isabel's death, had subtly isolated him from Isabel's family. He described finding one of Isabel's pearl earrings, not at the bottom of the staircase, but tucked away in a drawer in Eleanor's old apartment months after they were married. He detailed how Eleanor's story of the fall changed subtly over the years, the details shifting like sand. It was a chronicle of a cold, patient investigation, a husband's heartbroken quest for a truth no one else wanted to see. The final entry from 6 months ago was written in a shaky hand. I am running out of time. The doctors give me months. Mark sees only the empire, and Clara, my sweet Clara, is too gentle to see the viper in her own home. I cannot prove it in a court of law, but I can make the truth my final legacy. I will not let Eleanor profit from the grave she dug for my Isabel. The money will be the bait. Let the guilt or the greed reveal the monster I married. May God forgive me for letting it go on this long. Tears streamed down Clara's face, dripping onto the brittle pages. They were not tears of sadness, but of a terrible, clarifying rage. Her father hadn't been paranoid. He had been a prisoner, just like her. He had seen the viper, and now he had finally given his daughter the venom she needed to fight back. Armed with her father's journal, Clara felt a cold, hard resolve settle in her soul. The grief and confusion had been burned away, leaving behind the pure, unyielding steel of her father's conviction. She found Eleanor not in her bedroom, but in the grand conservatory at the back of the house, a glass palace filled with exotic orchids her father had cultivated. Eleanor was calmly snipping a dead leaf from a phalaenopsis, the very picture of domestic tranquility. The performance was breathtaking in its audacity. We need to talk, Clara said, her voice devoid of its usual softness. She held up the black journal. Eleanor's hand froze, the silver shears glinting in the filtered sunlight. She turned slowly, her eyes fixing on the book. The mask of the grieving widow slipped, revealing the cold, calculating woman beneath. A flicker of genuine fear crossed her face before being replaced by pure venom. Snooping, Clara? That's beneath you, she said, her voice a low hiss. Or perhaps it isn't. You were always his little pet, weren't you? He knew, Clara stated, taking a step forward. He knew everything. The rug, the earring, the way your story changed. He wrote it all down. Eleanor let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound like breaking glass. A book of fantasies. Richard lost his mind at the end. Everyone knows that. He was obsessed with a woman who was too weak to live. Her name was Isabel. Clara's voice cracked, but she held her ground. She was my mother, and you killed her. The accusation hung in the humid, flower-scented air between them. Eleanor set the shears down with a deliberate click. She straightened her spine, and all pretense of innocence, of panic, of grief, evaporated completely. What was left was terrifying in its raw, unveiled malevolence. Killed her? Eleanor sneered, her lips curling. Don't be so melodramatic. I simply removed an obstacle. Your mother was a fragile, sentimental fool. She was holding Richard back. He had ambition, greatness in him, but she wanted to chain him to a quiet, boring life. She was a weight tied to his ankle, and I cut the rope. Clara stared, horrified, as the confession she'd heard whispered in the lawyer's office was now laid bare in all its monstrous logic. You pushed her. She was hysterical, Eleanor said dismissively, as if discussing a minor inconvenience. We were arguing at the top of the stairs. I told her Richard deserved more than she could ever offer him, that he deserved a woman of strength, a partner. She got in my face, weeping, pathetic. A little shove was all it took. She was as delicate as one of these orchid blossoms. She gestured around the room. Beautiful, but useless. I gave your father an empire. I gave this family everything. She would have given you mediocrity. I did what was necessary. The sheer lack of remorse, the pride in her voice, struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a corporate takeover executed in a hallway. Eleanor saw Isabel not as a human being, but as a rival to be eliminated. You did it for the money, Clara breathed, the final ugly piece clicking into place. Eleanor smiled, a chilling, triumphant expression. The money was the means to an end. It was about power, the power I deserved, the life I built from the ashes of her weakness. And I would have had it all, the fortune and the legacy, if not for your father's sentimental, dying wish, and for you, a pathetic copy of your mother, standing there with his little book of lies. She took a step toward Clara, her eyes blazing with decades of resentment. You think that book will save you? It's your word against mine. And in this world, my dear, my word is worth far more. The threat was clear. Clara was holding the truth, but Eleanor held the power, or so she thought. In that moment, Clara knew this couldn't be a private war. It had to be a public execution. Clara felt the weight of the journal in her hands as if it were a slab of granite. The truth was heavy, ugly, and irrefutable. She had to believe that Mark, for all his avarice, still possessed a fundamental core of decency. He was her brother. He had to be horrified by what their mother had done. He had to choose what was right. She found him in the library, a decanter of whiskey at his elbow, surrounded by spreadsheets and legal documents. He was mapping out his future, a future built on a foundation he refused to examine. He looked up as she entered, his expression impatient. "Clara, I am swamped. The lawyers are preparing the motion. Whatever it is, can it wait?" "No," she said, her voice steady. She walked to the desk and placed their father's journal directly on top of his papers. "It can't." Mark glanced at the book with disdain. "I told you, I'm not interested in Dad's delusions." "They aren't delusions," Clara insisted, her gaze pleading with him to listen, to understand. "I confronted her, Mark, in the conservatory. She told me everything." She recounted the entire conversation, her voice trembling with the horror of it. She described Eleanor's cold confession, her pride, her contempt for their biological mother, her chilling admission that she had removed an obstacle. As she spoke, she watched Mark's face, searching for the shock, the revulsion, the solidarity she so desperately needed. She found nothing. He listened with a stony stillness, his eyes unreadable. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. He picked up his glass, swirled the amber liquid, and took a slow sip. "So she said some things she didn't mean," he said finally, his tone dismissive. "She's under immense pressure, grieving. You cornered her and she lashed out." Clara felt a sickening lurch in her stomach. "Mark, did you hear me? She confessed to murdering my mother, our father's first wife. She felt no remorse. She was proud of it." "And what do you want to do with this information, Clara?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. "Go to the police? Turn our mother in? Create a scandal that will shatter this family, destroy the company, and ensure that every penny of Dad's fortune is tied up in legal battles for the next 20 years before it goes to some charity?" "It's the truth!" she cried, her voice breaking. "It's about justice for Isabel, for Dad! He died trying to get this justice!" Mark slammed his glass down on the desk. "Justice?" he scoffed, rising to his feet. "There is no justice, Clara. There is only power and perception. For 30 years, Eleanor has been our mother. She raised us. She built this family into what it is. And you want to tear it all down for a woman you don't even remember, based on the ramblings in a dead man's diary and a confession from a woman pushed to her breaking point?" His words were like slaps to the face. He wasn't just rationalizing. He was choosing a side. He was choosing the lie. "She's a monster, Mark, and you're protecting her." "I'm protecting our future," he shot back, his face inches from hers. "Our legacy. You need to let this go. You need to forget what you heard. Forget this journal exists. The lawyers will handle the will. Mother will be fine, and we will all get what we are owed. This is your final chance to be a part of this family. Don't throw it away." The betrayal was absolute, more painful even than Eleanor's confession. Eleanor was a stranger who had worn a mother's mask. Mark was her brother. He saw the same evil she did, but he was willing to embrace it for profit. He was asking her not just to be silent, but to be complicit. Clara stared into his cold, determined eyes and saw the last vestiges of her family turn to dust. She was utterly, completely alone, and in that isolation, she found a terrible, unshakable strength. "I can't do that," she whispered. He had made his choice. Now she would make hers. The annual Sterling Foundation Charity Gala was the crown jewel of the Boston social calendar. It was an evening of performative philanthropy where the city's elite gathered to write checks and affirm their own importance. This year, it was also meant to be a memorial to Richard Sterling and a triumphant public debut for Mark as the new head of the family and the company. It was the perfect stage. Clara arrived late, slipping through the glittering crowd unnoticed. The ballroom of the Copley Plaza was a sea of black ties and designer gowns. On a raised dais at the front of the room, Mark and Eleanor stood side by side, accepting condolences. Eleanor was the picture of tragic grace in a floor-length navy gown, a single strand of pearls at her throat. Mark was confident and charming, shaking hands, already the king of his new domain. They were a portrait of resilience, the very image of a family weathering a storm with dignity. The hypocrisy was nauseating. Clara made her way to the side of the stage, her father's journal clutched in her hand like a prayer book. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her purpose was a cold, steady flame. Mark stepped up to the podium to deliver the keynote address. "My father, Richard Sterling, was a man of vision," he began, his voice resonating with practiced sincerity. "He believed in family, in legacy, and in building a better future. In his honor, my mother and I are proud to carry that vision forward." That was her cue. Clara walked up the side steps and onto the stage. A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. Mark faltered, his eyes widening in shock and fury as he saw her. "Clara, what are you doing?" he hissed under his breath. She walked past him to the microphone, her simple black dress a stark contrast to the opulence around her. She looked out at the hundreds of expectant faces. "My name is Clara Sterling," she said, her voice shaking but clear, amplified throughout the cavernous hall. "My brother is right. My father was a man of vision, but the legacy he cared about most was not one of money, but one of truth." Mark lunged for her arm, but she sidestepped him. "My father's will contained a final clause," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "He offered his entire fortune to whoever confessed the truth about the death of his first wife, my mother, Isabel Sterling." A collective gasp swept the room. All eyes flew to Eleanor, whose face had gone ashen. "My father knew her death was no accident," Clara's voice rang out, filled with 30 years of silenced pain. "He spent his life searching for a truth that our family chose to bury." She held up the journal. "He kept a record of every lie, every inconsistency, and just last week, the woman who benefited most from my mother's death confirmed his suspicions. She confessed it all to me." She looked directly at Eleanor, who stood frozen in a spotlight of horror. "She told me my mother was an obstacle. That sheer moved her with a shove down a flight of stairs. That she did it for power and for the money she stands to inherit." Pandemonium erupted. The air crackled with shouts and frantic whispers. The press at the back of the room surged forward, cameras flashing like machine gun fire. Mark grabbed the microphone. "My sister is unwell. She is distraught with grief and—" But it was too late. Clara had already turned to the last page of her father's journal, reading his final damning words into the microphone. "I will not let Eleanor profit from the grave she dug for my Isabel. Let the guilt or the greed reveal the monster I married." The words hung in the air, a verdict delivered from beyond the grave. Eleanor let out a strangled cry and collapsed, not in a faint, but in a heap of broken pride and utter ruin. Mark stood paralyzed, his perfect future crumbling into ash around him. Amidst the chaos, Clara saw 2 uniformed police officers who had been working security at the event, moving purposefully toward the stage. Justice, swift and public, had finally arrived. 6 months later, the autumn leaves were turning to fire and gold in the Mount Auburn Cemetery. Clara stood before 2 headstones side by side. One was weathered, bearing the name Isabel Sterling, beloved wife and mother. The other was new, polished granite, Richard Sterling, a man of truth. She placed a small bouquet of white lilies, Isabel's favorite, between them. The storm had passed. The Sterling Gala became the scandal of the decade. Faced with Richard's journal and the testimony of several gala attendees who heard her breakdown, Eleanor had no choice but to give a full confession to the authorities. The trial was swift. Her life sentence would be served not in a mansion, but in a state prison. Mark's downfall was just as complete. The codicil of the will was upheld. As Eleanor had confessed, she was legally entitled to the $400 million fortune. However, a subsequent civil suit, filed by Clara on behalf of her mother's estate, and the state's Slayer statute, preventing a killer from profiting from their crime, ensured Eleanor would never see a dime. The money was locked away, destined to be redirected to the charities Richard had named. Disgraced and disowned by the business community, Mark had sold his shares in the company and disappeared, a pariah stripped of the name and wealth he had prized above all else. Clara had been left with the small personal trust her father had originally intended for her. It was more than enough. She had walked away from the main fortune, the blood money as she now thought of it. She couldn't touch it. Her inheritance was not the sterling empire, but the truth. She had sold her share of the cold, cavernous mansion and bought a small, light-filled brownstone in the South End. It was a quiet place, filled with books and plants, and the peaceful silence her father had always sought. She was volunteering at the children's hospital he had endowed, finding a purpose not in managing wealth, but in continuing his genuine, quiet kindness. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead. For the first time in her life, the low-grade hum of anxiety was gone. The foundation of her world was no longer sand, but solid ground, built not on lies and money, but on a painful, cleansing truth. She was not the underappreciated daughter anymore. She was the keeper of her father's true legacy. Looking at the two names etched in stone, she felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. She had lost a mother and a brother, but she had found her own mother and reclaimed her father. She had not inherited his riches, but something far more valuable, his character. And in the quiet stillness of the cemetery, Clara Sterling finally felt free.